According to this organization, Maine has more coastline than California, which should be a little surprising considering Maine is nowhere near the size of California. And even with that said, it doesn't even look like Maine has that big of a coastline. This looks like it would barely go from San Diego to LA, yet here we are with California logged with having 3,400 miles of shoreline, yet Maine has about 50 miles more. Now, a big factor here is what is known as the coastline paradox. This is the counterintuitive observation that the coastline of a landmass does not have a well-defined length. It's kind of like an optical illusion at play here when your eyes first see, for instance, the British Isles. It doesn't look that big, but when you really get into the details of it and actually measure each coastline with all the crevices, the coast gets longer and longer and longer. So though Maine does not look very big, as you can see, they've got a lot more things going on along their coastline. A lot more ridges, a lot more islands also. That's a big factor here. There are over 4,600 islands off the coast of Maine. They even have some inland too. California also has a lot of islands, but this is still half as many. I remember doing a geography coastline test in the past. You'd be surprised at how much islands make a huge difference. Indonesia, for example, is nothing but islands, so almost every single mile they have all contributes to their coastline. Why does this part of Italy have such poor air quality? It's especially weird considering most of the peninsula is fine, but as soon as you get too far north, it can be really bad. Part of the explanation for this is just the geography of Italy. This whole region is just squeezed in between mountain ranges. It's almost like a mountain range peninsula. Combine that with the fact that a lot of Italians live up here, which means they're gonna have more industry. You then have a recipe for disaster or just like really bad air quality. There's actually a world air pollution live map you can find. This region of Italy doesn't always suffer from this, but from time to time, it's still nowhere near the levels of China right now. Speaking of coastline, how did Norway get all of this? And why did they cut off Sweden and Finland from the North Pole? Something often looked over is Finland is not the only Nordic country that borders Russia. Norway stretches all the way over to border them as well. Unsurprisingly, a lot of this can be explained with geography. Norway is actually just a giant mountain range. And with that said, most of their people have always lived along the coast. In fact, almost 2/3 of all of Norway is mountainous. And as you can see from their population density maps, it's hard for people to live in those mountains, or at least for a lot of their people to live in those mountains. The vast majority live in their capital, Oslo, and then they stretch all around the country, sticking close to the coast. This theme continues pretty much all the way up north as well. And this is pretty much how it's been the entire time for this region, even dating back to the Viking invasion. But this is important to note because the Vikings were very seafaring people. They were constantly using boats to explore and to pillage probably more so than the other at this time. With all that said, the Norwegian peoples had a lot more of a connection to this northern coast than Sweden or Finland. I mean, there's like a giant mountain wall that just keeps them out from here. Historically speaking, there's just a little bit more of a connection. And remember, Norway doesn't just have all that northern coastline, they also have several islands up here. The biggest one being Svalbard, one of the most isolated places you can go. Norway's claim to that island in the first place is the geographic proximity, Norwegians' familiarity, and the fact that a majority of the population was already from Norway there. Include that with the fact that the Norwegians were getting to Iceland, Greenland, and parts of North America. They really were like these Arctic Polynesians in a way. Fun fact, it is actually possible to sail from Turkey to Spain without going through the Mediterranean. I don't exactly know why Turkey would want to do this, but if for some reason the Mediterranean just drained tomorrow, at least they have other options. Well, as long as it's just the Mediterranean and not also the Black Sea. Something I myself often forget about are the international waterways. There are plenty of routes to just go through the continent. There's actually an even quicker route for Turkey if they go through Ukraine and then they pop out through the Baltic Sea right here. And actually, if you're wondering why countries built cities in certain locations, this is such a great map to help explain that to you. For instance, London, as well as the city of Sevilla in Spain. I was just in Sevilla learning about this. Though it seems inland, it is connected to this coast. It's about 50 miles away. This was actually a huge hub for Spain during their colonial days, since it's technically a port city connected directly to the Atlantic. And it definitely helped that that city was located towards the southern tip down here. Why is Lake Winnipeg not considered one of the Great Lakes? I mean, it does look pretty big along the same size. In fact, Lake Winnipeg is the 12th largest lake in the world, and it even beats out Lake Ontario. The issue for this body of water isn't that it's not necessarily close to the Great Lakes, although I would assume that's kind of a problem. I mean, all these are kind of clustered together. This one is kind of far off. But this water is a part of a completely different system. You can't go from Lake Winnipeg to Lake Ontario, for example. These all drain north, actually, towards the Hudson Bay. That's pretty much what it comes down to. Larry Ellis, founder of Oracle, bought the 6th largest island in Hawaii. He paid $300 million for it back in 2012, which kind of seems like a steal. Now, he doesn't technically own 100% of the island, but close enough. He owns 98% of the island, which is 90 acres. When are we gonna start throwing dinosaurs on this bad boy? Even though the original Jurassic Park was supposed to be off the coast of Costa Rica, they ended up filming that in Hawaii. It's close enough. On that same note, why doesn't the Hawaiian Islands have a ferry service? Especially when a country like Greece, for instance, has a very intricate ferry service. You could basically go all over the place. Part of the issue for Hawaii is they did, and they've been trying. It's just not working. The Hawaiian Super Ferry Service ended in 2009. Also, the Hawaiian Islands are just a lot larger than those Greek islands. There's less of a need to go in between each of them. Seems like everyone I know just kind of flies to Maui and then they take one more plane to whatever island they wanted to go to. Also, the distance between each island is a huge factor here. Also, this is like in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That water can get really rough sometimes, but maybe they'll figure it out one day. The state of New York is the only state besides Hawaii where a majority of people live on an island. And this is so crazy to me. Only about 9.9 million live in upstate New York. Meanwhile, 10 million live right here. Maybe we need to be more careful using the term upstate. I'm still unsure what we define it as. These really just feel like two different places at this point. Let's just make this island its own like state. But wait a second, if Hawaii and New York have most of their people living on islands, what about Rhode Island? Technically, some people classify Long Island as a peninsula, but geographically speaking, it does fall under the defining terms of islands. There is a waterway that disconnects it. There's also Staten Island and Manhattan that's contributing. This video's theme here is just like, what do you consider an island and coastline and stuff like that? Japan and their 4 major islands and Vietnam are almost the exact same size. They even get a little bit thicker here in the north, and there's a very similar curvature that they both have. Now, because Vietnam is not an island, did they intentionally make their borders like this so they could mimic Japan? That would explain a lot. And this is not even the first time the Vietnam country has mimicked something else. Who exactly is going to copy strike them? Japan or the Nile River Delta? Someone's got to stop them over there. Meanwhile, your average city, there aren't even 2 airports in my city. Compare that to Turks and Caicos. Population 45,000, number of airports 9. Yes, Turks and Caicos for some reason has 9 airports. Of course, these islands are considered British overseas territories, but you can look up the fact that they do have 9 right here. I mean, a big factor here obviously is just the fact that there's a bunch of islands and possibly no ferry system, because that explains everything. Actually, no, they are doing a little bit better than Hawaii. There is a ferry system, but there's clearly a lot of people that would still just rather fly. We can also cherry pick examples from all around the world. The biggest island in the world, Greenland, has 45 airports. I feel like when there's not a whole lot of other options but to fly, yeah, you're gonna need a lot of airports. Some of these are heliports though, to be fair. I mean, technically speaking, you really don't even need that much land to call an airport. You can have just like a really small runway for very tiny planes, and there you go, that's an airport. Satellite imagery of quintessential cities in the United States. This is New Orleans, Louisiana, and I think this stuff is really good for any City Skylines fans out there. This is Baltimore. You can really see the difference between the high density zones and the low density areas. Like how easy it is to spot these stadiums as well. Here's my home city of Los Angeles. I like how smoggy it looks. Not surprised. As you can see, we didn't really decide to go high density everywhere. We just spread way too far out. Here is Miami, Florida, right along the beach. You can see how important waterways are to all these places. Speaking of which, here's Chicago. Not every place has a obvious waterway though. Here's Atlanta, Georgia. Detroit, Michigan, which is actually way more green than I thought. This is super green. Here's San Francisco, just completely gridded out. Like how one of these pixels probably costs like $1 million in real estate. Here's Boston. I would love what time of year this stuff was shot in. This is definitely looking like summer. This is a very nice looking Boston. And big thanks to my patrons this month. Drew, I'm your dad, back with the milk. Look outside. KirinoIsBestGirl. The clone's training is complete and is
Fredrik
Tibblin,
Tibblin, without
Australia is real.
InquisitorXarius,
The Great Ralph,
Jack Traven's annoying friend,
Sebby, if you hear this, I love you.
GoodOldRyah,
The Mexican 7
Ortin,
5 6 10
RyeThePie,
Carmel Saida,
LuxembourgLover.
And why am I doing this?